Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for another one of our wonderful MMGA March Madness webinars. Tonight, we're going to be hearing about dealing with wildlife conflict in the garden with Marnie Tichenau. We will be answering questions at the end of her presentation. If you have questions, please type them in the Q&A box that's found in the menu. I'm guessing you all have it at the bottom of your screen. I'd like to introduce the executive board members. Vicki Lauren, who's our secretary, Norm Scheer, our president. I'm Sue Hoggard, I'm the vice president and co-treasurer, along with Ruth Stillwalker, who's the other co-treasurer, and Ruth will be introducing Marnie tonight.
Good evening. As a Michigan gardener, you've probably done battle with the animals living in your yard. Whether you garden in an urban area or the country, you may face pressure on your gardens from deer, rabbits, raccoons, skunks, groundhogs, chipmunks, moles, voles, even geese and ducks. Tonight's speaker, Marnie Tichenau, earned a bachelor's in wildlife management and forestry from The Ohio State University in 2004 and went on to study forest wildlife at OSU School of Environment and Natural Resources, obtaining her master's degree in 2007. She's worked for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the USDA Forest Service, as well as a naturalist for the Columbus and Franklin County Metro Parks. Currently, she's a wildlife program specialist with OSU Extension, and we're very fortunate to have her here sharing her expertise with us tonight. Welcome, Marnie.
Thank you so much, Ruth and Sue, Vicki and Norm, and everybody on the call. Really appreciate the invitation to be here. I am from Ohio, so please don't hold that against me. Without any further ado, I'm going to start sharing my screen and we can get right into the presentation. Okay. So hopefully you're all seeing that first slide there. And I'm just going to pop up a few other things, namely the chat. I may be asking a few questions as we go along tonight, so if you're comfortable, feel free to answer in the chat. If not, feel free to sit back and relax. But I, for one, think it's a little bit fun if we can have some interaction as we go along here. So again, thanks, Ruth, for that introduction. I have been with the university as the wildlife program specialist for, well, since 2007, so quite a few years now. And not soon after I started, I began programming about this subject. And I have noticed over the years that there is definitely a need for this. And especially, you know, in light of the pandemic and all the time we've spent at home, I think recently folks have been paying a lot more attention to what's going on in their backyards. And so this is an even more popular topic. And so I'm excited to share a little bit about this, and let's go ahead and get started. So I love this picture that was shared with me by Jean Moore, because it's just the embodiment of sometimes what we deal with wildlife. So no doubt, whether you are living in a major metropolitan area, a smaller city, a town, or a village on the outskirts of a more urban area, you are living with wildlife. And maybe you don't realize it, but I bet most of you as master gardeners do. And as we can say, the wildlife, or as we can see, the wildlife that are living with us are very comfortable. And it's not just white-tailed deer. All of the species that you see here on this slide have adapted to coexist with humans. And for the most part, they're doing it very well. Now, when we live together, conflict can occur. So I want to just back up for a few minutes and talk about why we are living together. Why are we coexisting with so many different wildlife species. And this is could be the entire topic of the talk today, but in a nutshell, I'm going to give you some examples. And one of them is that first one that you see here, land cover changes, how we have changed the landscape and what impacts that has had on wildlife. And so one example would be an increase in development. Now, where I live, I'm in central Ohio, I'm in Delaware County, and you could say I'm roughly on the outskirts of greater Columbus area. And I have seen this area expand tremendously over the past several years. And I'm sure that many of you are perhaps in areas with that same situation. So the amount of development, whether it's for housing or commercial purposes, is expanding tremendously across the country. And when that happens, especially in the case of housing developments and folks are moving out closer to natural areas or to fields or farmland or other more less developed areas where there are established populations of wildlife. And so, of course, when we come in closer proximity, we're increasing the chance of having that conflict and those interactions. But I don't want to paint the picture that it's all of us. You know, it's our fault. We're moving out closer to the wildlife and we're taking away their habitat. I mean, that's part of it. That is a factor. But it's the wildlife themselves too, right? So wildlife, especially, you know, namely all those species we just looked at on the previous slide, are very adaptive. And they learn that with humans, with human habitat, come resources. And sometimes really nice, really well-tended and cared for resources. Okay, they recognize that our habitats are providing the food and the water and the shelter that they need to survive, and in some cases survive quite well. And so here are some examples of how we provide those habitat resources. You know, it could be conserving and creation of green spaces, our natural areas like our metro and local parks. It could be a community garden or a garden in your own backyard. It could be a golf course or a recreational sports field that's managed and maintained. And then it could be, of course, landscaping in our own backyard, which I understand you all had a talk recently on making your backyards more wildlife friendly. Okay, so, you know, sometimes we are intentionally creating habitat for wildlife, and more often we are creating habitat for the birds and the pollinators, but you're still putting out some great food, cover, and shelter resources. And all the other wildlife recognize that and appreciate it, even if this was not your intention. So again, we talk about, you know, gardening for wildlife, and I know, getting ahead of myself. I know many of you may be interested in gardening for wildlife or wildscaping, as I sometimes call it, and providing some plants and hopefully some woody plants as well that provide good resources for wildlife. And I love this picture taken by my coworker, Amy Stone, of a goldfinch taking advantage of these purple coneflower seeds. And so, you know, when we do these things, and it's great when we do these things because these species like our birds and our pollinators really do need the help. But when we do these things, we are, of course, again, putting out that habitat, and odds are you're going to be welcoming some other critters into the yard. And so here are some general steps to take when you encounter conflict or wildlife damage, as I have here on this slide. Number one is very important, of course, identifying the species that is causing the damage. And as we go through today, I'll give you some hints and tips that will hopefully help you to do that in your own yards and landscapes and gardens. Number two goes right along with that, okay? Understanding the species habitat needs. Okay, when we understand more about the behaviors and the needs of wildlife, we are better equipped to deal with the damage that they sometimes cause. And we're better equipped to understand why they are causing that damage. And sometimes if we understand the why, the fix is very easy. Now, the definition of wildlife damage is to use to use appropriate control methods that are cost effective. The idea being to reduce damage down to a tolerable level. And that's going to be kind of a theme as we go through here, that tolerable level, or I may say your own level of coexistence. So it's all about, what you are comfortable with. And you'll find, and probably already have in talking to friends and neighbors, that tolerance levels shift, right? And you may be more tolerant of the deer eating your landscape than your neighbor is. So it's up to each one of you as to what that tolerance level is, or what that level of coexistence is. But there does need to be one. When it comes to wildlife damage, there is rarely a silver bullet, and sometimes you're using multiple management options to lessen the damage enough so you're comfortable. Okay, so going in with it, or going into wildlife damage thinking I'm going to completely eliminate the damage, at times is unrealistic. So when I talk about management options, here is what I am referring to. And as we go through today, we're going to talk about each one of these, and I'm going to be giving you some examples of different wildlife species that we tend to use these management options on the most. So repellents, which is when you apply a chemical to usually a food source, and it makes that food source smell or taste bad. Exclusion is putting up a barrier between the animal and what you're trying to protect. I'm going to skip education for now. Habitat modification, this one is probably the most important one of all, because it goes back to learning more about the animal's behavior and its habits. And if you know what that animal is attracted to in your backyard in the first place, can you modify it? Can you change it to solve the problem? Okay, usually it's some sort of food or cover or both. Trapping, pretty self-explanatory. We'll touch on that briefly. We're not going to touch too much on lethal control, but we'll mention it a few times with some species. And then harassment, so scaring the animal away from the area. And we're definitely going to talk about that today. So then going back up to education, you're all doing that already, right? So kudos to you. In other situations when I'm talking to community leaders, sometimes it's educating the public on management options they may be taking to alleviate damage from a certain wildlife species. And so you all as master gardeners, you may also play that role. If you're working in a community garden or helping out in a park or something like that, you may be that point person that can share information with the general public as to why you're putting up a fence that may be unsightly. So that education component is really important, especially to help the public understand why you're doing what you're doing, and also to let them know what they can do if they're encountering some issues. So this evening we're going to go through 5 situations, and you may have these situations going on in your own backyard or in a community area that you're helping with. But I wanted to take this approach knowing that you've already had some webinars on putting out some wildlife friendly habitat. So we're kind of looking at it from that perspective. If you're actively putting out habitat, sometimes this negative happens with a wildlife species you don't want, and how do you address that? So that's kind of the approach we're going to be taking. And so the first is one I know you are all familiar with, and it's called tasty victuals. So perhaps, and this could apply to, as you see there, the beautiful garden, sun-loving garden that you've maybe put out to bring in some birds and pollinators, bees and butterflies. It could also apply to maybe some woody plants that you're putting out for wildlife. So that picture down there at the bottom is of a cedar waxwing in a serviceberry, which is one of my favorite landscape plants for birds. They just love the berries, and the berries are pretty tasty for us as well. So you do all this work, and then before you know it, you see something like this, hostas that have been eaten to the ground, maybe some rubbing damage to a sapling or a smaller shrub that you have in your yard. And of course, we are looking at the culprit here, which would be the modern day Bambi. So what do you do? Well, first of all, let's talk a little bit about identifying deer damage. I'm just going to go back real quickly to those pictures because that's a great example of a rub and what it looks like. And of course, deer rubs, they start towards the end of the summer as the males are prepping for the breeding season. Sometimes they'll rub to remove the velvet from their antlers, but most of the rubbing damage is the males leaving scent stations behind for females or other males. Okay, so sometimes they will repeatedly come back to the same tree if they really like it to rub on it. But as you can see from this picture, if we're talking about a smaller tree or a sapling, it can be deadly, excuse me, to the tree. And then the hostas, what I want you to note there is the very messy appearance, those very jagged edges that are left behind. And that is characteristic of deer damage. So there's the hosta picture again, but a few closer up pictures of a tomato plant right here. And then this is an ash seedling. And even though, you know, it may be kind of hard to tell, you're still seeing some kind of jagged edges and some pieces and parts left behind. And that's ideally what you're going to be looking for when it comes to deer damage. So if you know the anatomy of a deer jaw, you might know that they lack upper incisors. And so when they grasp a plant, they're going to grasp and a lot of times just kind of pull back a little bit and allow that plant to tear. And that's why you get those very jagged edges. You can also look at where the damage on the plant is occurring. Keeping in mind they're a large animal and sometimes that damage is from the top down, so tops of smaller shrubs and plants or along the sides. Whereas if you're having a lot of damage from the ground up, you're probably dealing with something else like a rabbit. So let's get into some management strategies. And we're going to start by talking a little bit about repellents. Now, if you've used a repellent before, go ahead and put it in the chat if it's worked for you, if you've had success. I usually ask this of folks because I think it's a management option that folks reach for often with deer, and we can throw rabbit in as well. And it's good, it's a good option. But you'll find in talking to folks that sometimes they work and sometimes they don't. And one of the biggest reasons why they don't work is, well, there's several reasons, is if you have very hungry deer, okay? If you have a lot of deer in the area, or if your backyard is the only good food available in the area, that's when something that makes a plant smell bad or taste bad just isn't going to be effective. The other time when repellents don't work is if you wait too long and deer have already been munching on that plant for a while, and they're used to it and they're comfortable in that part of your yard. And then you go and you make it smell or taste bad, it may not work so great to repel them, okay? So I see a few people have said deer scram, it works for a while, they get used to it. Cayenne pepper, plant skid, yes. Garlic and hot pepper, wonderful. So yeah, we'll be talking in just a few minutes on some of the ones that really don't do work. No, sorry, Myriad, who said, well, repellents don't work when there are 18 at a time in the yard. Yes, definitely. So you do see on this slide some of the active ingredients that have shown to be effective from research trials. And I have them listed here by active ingredient, and that's usually how I share them. I don't tend to share product names because I want folks to flip over that bottle and look at that active ingredient, because that's how you know it's really going to have that ingredient that works the best. And so hot pepper, sometimes it's listed as cayenne or capsaicin, all the same thing. Okay, that's a good one to look for. Eggs, egg solids, egg products, something, you know, egg related. That's a really good one as well. So I'll mention liquid fence. Sue and I were talking about that before we started. That's a good one. It's mostly egg solids. Okay, so that's one that's been shown to be quite effective per that active egg ingredient. Oops. And then I also have blood products listed. So somebody said plant skid, okay? And that's another one that, that you can try. Three more things on repellents. You'll notice that I have taste only, okay? And that applies for generally all of the repellents. So for the most part, again, going back to research trials, those repellents that were applied directly to the plants worked better than those that relied on just odor alone to protect the plants. Okay, so look for those contact or those taste repellents where the animal has to get it into their mouth to taste it. And so you may have a little bit of damage while you're waiting for that repellent to be effective. Food safe repellents, as you see down there, unfortunately, we're looking at a lot shorter list, but there are some that are effective. Hinder is one I'll mention that is a name brand, but it's ammonium or potassium salts and fatty acids. Those are generally a food safe active ingredients. And then some of the hot pepper and egg solid repellents are food safe. Just make sure you're reading your label and you're checking your label to make sure they work. And then just a few other things. Somebody in the chat said the deer get used to them. And you run that risk with just about any management option that you throw up against deer, because again, they're a very adaptive animal, and you got to keep them on their hooves. Okay. You got to keep them guessing. So have several different repellents with these effective ingredients in your arsenal and switch them out throughout the season. And then use other management options as well at the same time, which we'll get into next. So one would be to pick plants that aren't as tasty as others. So if there are any other Indiana Jones fans like I am, I grew up with Indiana Jones, and this one was my favorite movie. And the knight said, choose wisely. And this applies definitely to our deer or to our landscaping if we're having issues with deer. So I will share a longer resource with you, but since I know you've been talking about creating some wildlife friendly landscapes, a lot of the plants that we sometimes promote for our pollinators especially are lower down on the list of deer tasty plants, which is a good thing. Okay, we like to have that, those double duty plants, I guess, good for the pollinators and not quite as tasty for the deer. Remembering always that nothing stops a hungry animal. And so next I'll give you several woody plants that are less preferred by deer. And all of these plants make for nice landscape plants. And again, like I said, they're less tasty for deer. The great news also about these, putting on my other hat here, is that they are all bird and pollinator friendly trees and shrubs. So all of these offer some sort of bloom that is attractive to a pollinator, berry that is good for the birds, shelter, or some other aspect. So again, a good double duty list. And the link that is down there at the bottom of the screen, you're going to see this quite a bit. So this is the Michigan Department of Natural Resources website. And if you search nuisance wildlife, you'll get their general information site on nuisance wildlife. And there's a drop-down menu with all different types of wildlife species. And if you click on deer, there's some good resources for you there. One of which is a list of deer resistant plants. And I believe they have it organized by those plants that are frequently damaged all the way down to those plants that are infrequently damaged, which is really nice to have in my opinion, because you have a list of, okay, I'm going to stay away from these plants if I have deer trouble, and I'm going to focus on these plants. And then a great example of combining management options would be to choose some of these less tasty deer plants and then apply a repellent to them. And that's going to make them even more effective. Okay, so Ruth Ann says dogwood, wow, they love it in my yard. So red osier is one of the shrub dogwoods, which again is less preferred, but Ruth Ann, you're bringing up an excellent point in that this is one of those management options that can be variable. Same with repellents. It really goes back to the deer in your yard, in your community, and what they've experienced before, and what other food sources are available, okay? So you'll find that as you start talking to different folks. Allium is a good choice too. Yes, definitely, Babette. Okay, so moving away from repellents and deer-resistant plants, here's a scare tactic that you can try against deer. And I'm going to share a video because I'm a visual person and I feel like it expresses a lot more how these motion-activated sprinklers can work. So before we go, I'm going to point out, hopefully you can see my pointer here. This is one motion activated sprinkler. And then there's another one right over here. And as you will see in this video, they are working well to keep the deer out of these areas. I'm just gonna, hopefully I can advance it a little bit here. I was trying to, it's not letting me. Ah, there we go. You don't need to see the whole thing. Okay. So the fawn is going to encounter a sprinkler, and then you're going to see the same thing happen to mama. Now, had she stayed out of the landscape here, she would have been fine, but she didn't. She went to cover, which makes sense. Her fawn was a little spooked. She's a little spooked, but then that happens. So that's basically how these work. And then there goes the fawn running away out front. So these can be rather effective, not just against deer, but other animals as well. Just remember where you put them. Okay, I have had folks say, hey, they work well on nosy neighbors as well. So, hey, you know, whatever you want to use them for. But oftentimes they're adjustable, so you can adjust the height. But the other really important thing about harassment techniques like this is that you want to, again, keep the deer on their toes. You want to move that sprinkler to different areas. So they don't expect exactly where it's going to be, because they will. They will learn where it is and they will avoid it. Okay, fencing is another option, depending on your situation. Polypropylene is the material that you're looking at right here. It's this black mesh material. I'm recommending this one as just an option, one of the options of fencing material. And I recommend it, especially for you master gardeners, if you're working in a community garden situation and you're finding that repellents aren't working and scare tactics aren't working and everything else, and you just really need to keep them out of that garden. This material it's durable, it's lightweight, and it lasts. And so I'm going to skip ahead a slide to share with you some research that was done by Purdue Extension, and they were using these fences to protect tree plantations. And they found that it reduced deer browsing by 60 to 98%, and the lifespan was rather high on these fences, about 6 to 8 years. Okay, so I think it's a good material, and again, easy to work with and can provide a good option. So going back, I often get the question, how tall do deer fences need to be? And so a deer can jump an 8-foot fence if they want to, and if they have, you know, some room to land on the other side. If you're fencing off a smaller area where there's not a lot of room on the inside, you can get away with a shorter fence, maybe 5 feet or something like that. But if you are, you know, a larger area and you really need to keep them out, that fence needs to go from the ground to at least 8 feet. And make sure you stake it down to the bottom, because they will try to go under it before they go over it. This is a fence I want to mention for any of you that are able to have an electric fence. I know there, you know, obviously are restrictions there, especially within communities. But if you're in a more rural area and you are able to have an electric fence, this one is highly effective. It's called the peanut butter fence because, as you can see in that bottom picture, it's an electric fence. And if you place a bit of tinfoil or screening material, bend it over that wire and put a dab of peanut butter on it. What you're going to essentially be doing there is drawing the deer's nose or tongue to that peanut butter, because if you're a peanut butter lover like me, why would you not? But that electric shock is then going to be delivered to a much more sensitive spot on the deer, as opposed to, you know, anywhere else that's fur covered where it really wouldn't do much. Okay, so it's also it can also be a temporary fence, so it can be one that is easily taken up or put down, because it's only a single strand, though you can make it double strand, as you see in this picture. So this is from my coworker, and he uses this to protect his Christmas tree plantation. So going to some research, it was found to be 90% effective in small cornfields, 15 acres or less. So obviously something smaller like that, this is also going to be a very effective fence. So we're going to leave deer. I spend a little bit more time on deer than I probably will with the other species, just because I know it's one that commonly causes conflicts. But if you would like more information, this is a nice fact sheet from Michigan State University Extension. And if you Google this, it's pretty easy to find. And then Rebecca and Sarah also put together a really nice video. It's about a 5-minute video, and it gives you some more options on safe gardening to deter deer. Oh, and you can access it again by going to the Michigan DNR and searching nuisance wildlife and looking for deer. So it's posted right there within their resources. Okay, so we're going to move on to our next situation. And so kind of sticking again with that, that idea of wildscaping your yards, or birdscaping in this example. Say you've really been working to maybe incorporate some woody shrubs into the landscape because you've learned that those that produce berries can be a really important food source for not only our migratory birds, like you see the wood thrush in the top picture, and our cedar waxwing in the bottom, but also for our birds like robins and chickadees and things like that stick around during bluebirds during the winter and need that winter food source. And speaking of winter, you might notice some damage like the bottom picture there. Okay, specifically during the winter, you might be walking around your yard and looking at your woody shrubs, and you're seeing kind of the tips of some of those branches very neatly clipped off. And so the culprit here, of course, is the cottontail rabbit. And even though you didn't mean to do it, you created rabbit habitat, which I like to call rabbitat. So situation 2 is rabbitat. What do you do? Well, first of all, let's talk a little bit about rabbit damage. Number one test, especially on when it comes to woody plants, is looking for that 45-degree angle, like you see there in that picture on the right. And there's a contrasting picture of what deer looks like, deer damage looks like. But that very neat, sharp, clipped appearance is a dead giveaway. So 2 is the fact that the damage usually isn't much higher than 2.5 feet above the ground. Now, the exception, especially for you all in Michigan, would be this, right? Snow cover. Rabbit are active year-round, and they are light enough to be able to traverse right on top of that snow cover. And so in this picture, the rabbit started chewing on the bark of this shrub. And then once the snow melted, you see that damage has appeared much higher up, which in times can be really confusing. I've seen rabbit damage 4 to 5 feet high from snow drifts. So it can be a little disorienting, but do realize that on occasion, that rabbit damage can be higher up. Just sharing a few pictures of rabbit sign in my yard. And so the picture on the right is just from this past winter. They were munching a bit on my viburnum. It was in my front yard, and they left evidence behind. So if you are having issues identifying rabbit damage as far as damage to the plants, like I've shown, you can also look for evidence of rabbit scat. And I often say it looks exactly like Cocoa Puffs cereal. And if you've eaten that cereal, then maybe you would agree with me. So it's a good way to remember what rabbit scat looks like. It's often found in close proximity to the areas where they are feeding. So this picture that you're looking at is ideal, we could say, rabbitat again, right? This is what they like. They are a prey species, and so they like very dense areas that provide them cover from above. And so when we talk about rabbits, one of the big things that we talk about to reduce conflict is removing those habitat attractants. So this habitat modification that we talked about earlier. And a lot of times for rabbit, it's cover. So that could be, a brush pile. Sometimes it's something that is much more manicured or intentionally placed in your yard, like we talked about, for the birds. And this isn't an option. And I understand that, but this is something you always want to kind of go through in your mind when you encounter an issue. Okay, what is the attractant? Can I modify it? Am I willing to modify it? And sometimes the answer is no, and that's okay. Then you move on to these other options. So rabbits are an herbivore, just like deer. And many of the things we talked about with deer can also apply to rabbit, namely repellents. Okay, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. This is the same information I just presented on deer, but just know that those repellents that you get for deer, double duty work on rabbits as well. Another thing that you can simply do for rabbits is to put up a fence. And, of course, here we're talking about smaller areas. So these are the two raised beds in my own backyard. And if you're wondering why there are sunflowers in my garden, it's because my husband likes to grow seeds over the winter. Oh, he's starting them right now, in all honesty, and then plant them when they're small, when the time is right. And he thought he was planting eggplant, and they turned out to be sunflowers. So I told him, you are truly gardening for wildlife, because of course the birds enjoyed the sunflowers. But you can see our very simple fences there. Now we have raised beds. So we attached the fence kind of to the wood on our raised bed. But if you're planting directly into the ground, then again, your fence is just going to simply be into the ground. And a couple rules of thumb, like you see here in this picture, you want to make sure that the mesh is small enough. So you want to go with 1 inch or smaller mesh, or the rabbits, as you can see, will try to get through. You also want to go with a wire mesh, or they will snip right through it with their sharp upper and bottom incisors. So the fences, getting ahead of myself. So the fences don't have to be much higher than 3 feet, though do take account your snow. If you're trying to protect some woody plants, you might want to make them a little bit higher. And just make sure you're staking those fences to the ground, just securing them to the ground, and the rabbits aren't able to loosely get underneath them. Now, tree shelters and tubes are another great way to protect against damage. So, just taking some wire fencing and kind of making a cage around a woody shrub to keep the rabbits out and to keep them from munching during the winter can be very effective. On trees, like you see here in this picture, this can be effective to keep the rabbits from chewing on the bark. And this is also highly recommended for deer as well, to prevent that rubbing damage that we looked at earlier. Okay, moving on to situation number 3. And so you're looking at 2 examples of putting in some pollinator habitat. This situation is called Gotcha Covered, because like we just looked at with rabbits, you're once again providing some cover. But this time we're going to talk about a smaller animal. And here's one of the signs that you have this animal, and most likely multiples of this species, in your yard. So if you know what it is, put it in the chat. And Lori, yes, I will definitely share a copy of my slides with Sue, so she can get these out to you for sure. Yes, so the majority of you have got it exactly right. So we're looking at voles. There's another picture of what voles can do. And there's a picture of our meadow vole, at least here in Ohio. That's our most common vole that causes issues in the landscape, in the garden. Now, a few of you said moles, and we will in just a little bit look at some mole damage, just to look at the difference between the two. But going back, so that picture is in the way. If you see these little runways going through the yard, that is most definitely vole with a V damage. And what happens here is voles are active year round, and under snow cover, they will continue to move around right underneath that snow cover. And in these trails, they will reuse them over and over again. And so after time, they get worn down a little, where sometimes it may appear that they are actually underground. But really those tunnels start right at that ground level. So they are not a creature that typically lives underground like moles with an M do. So a few more slides on identifying vole damage. Like you saw in that last picture, they will chew on tubers, bulbs. Sometimes they will dig down to the base of plants and you will see parts of root systems missing or at times completely gone. That is also a sign of vole damage. And then you may see small girdled areas at the base of woody plants like you see here in this picture right here, where they've just kind of been feeding on that bark layer. And then of course the runways that we talked about. And in this picture, I do want to point out, you see a little hole here. So in some situations, voles will dig shallow holes underground. And usually you can take a stick and poke it into that hole and it stops. It doesn't keep on going like it would for a chipmunk, for example. So if you see a hole, it could still be voles, but you really want to look for these other signs in conjunction, just to make sure it isn't another critter. So just a few more pictures of some vole damage, and there's a picture of damage to root systems in that upper left picture, and some closer picture on the bottom right of what those tunnels look like after the snow is melted. So what are some things that we can do to protect against voles? Again, we have to start by talking about habitat modification. Now, in the case of a pollinator garden, then, obviously you're not going to want to take that out. But there are some other examples of cover that can still attract voles. So tall grasses, tall ornamental grasses, anything that lays flat on the ground, boards, straw bales, things like that, they love to kind of get underneath and rely on that for cover. And when you pick it up, though, you'll see the tunnels underneath, and you may even see some voles scattering. Less mulch. If you're having issues with voles, try using less mulch because they will burrow, they will go underneath the mulch and use that as cover like they would tall grass, like you see in this picture. And then think about any attractive food resources aside from, plants. So bird feeders where a lot of seed is falling on the ground, fruit trees where the fruit is laying on the ground. Those are other things that you can work to remove or eliminate if you're having a lot of issues with voles. Now, the thing about voles is their populations tend to go up and up and up and then eventually crash. And as they are going up, odds are the amount of damage you're seeing is also going to be going up. So if you've noticed, a few trails here and there last year, and this year you're seeing a few more trails and you're having a little bit more plant damage, that's a sign that maybe you need to reduce that population and bring it down. And the best way to do that is going to be to lethally remove some of those individuals from the population. And that's where trapping comes in. So in backyards and smaller landscapes, trapping can be a really effective tool. And so you can use just simple mouse snap traps like you see there in the above picture. And the figures A and B are kind of showing some examples on how you would place those traps. So placing them perpendicular along a runway. As I said, voles repeatedly use those runways. So a lot of times you don't even have to bait those traps. You just place them so that the vole will run right over them, and it can be very effective. And then in that figure B, I'm just showing an example of how you can cover those traps, which you definitely want to do to keep non-target species like birds especially from accidentally getting trapped in those traps. And then there are some repellents labeled for use on voles. So again, we see that hot pepper or capsaicin as the active ingredient, and then predator urine is another one that is registered for use on them. And what I'll just say about repellents is that this isn't a management option I would recommend if you're having, if you're to the point with your voles where it's beyond your tolerance level. At that point, you really do want to try some trapping or something to, to reduce that population level. And then you can use repellents in the interim while you're waiting for that trapping to bring that population down. Repellents may work shortly, but if you don't do anything else, they're going to lose their effectiveness. Okay, so again, a little interaction here. I have some pictures of damage caused by the next critter. So if you think you know what it is, pop it in the chat. And I have at the bottom right, that is a picture of the burrow entrance for this animal. And so see, it's only 2 inches long or 2 inches wide. Carol, Linda, Sherry, everybody's saying chipmunk. Yes, you are all right. So here we are talking about our smallest ground squirrel, the eastern chipmunk. And I have pictures of their burrow entrances because if you can locate these, it's good. As we will talk about later when it comes to management options, it's handy if you know where their burrow entrances are. But sometimes they're hard to find because chipmunks work quite hard to make those burrow entrances difficult to find. They will actually, if there's any dirt, dug out dirt from those burrows, they will actually put that dirt in their cheek pouches and carry it away. So they're not, having that dirt flag out as a flag to predators that, hey, there's a burrow here with something living in it. And then sometimes they'll those entrances will butt up against the edges of something. It could be like a sidewalk in this case, or your porch steps. Maybe you have some rocks or a log in your landscape. Those are places to kind of look. And I'm sure you all can list some other common chipmunk places. And then, we think of chipmunks as eating acorns and nuts and seeds, and they definitely do, but they will, of course, eat herbaceous plants, and they will chew on fruit and veggies as you see in these pictures. Management options for trapping or for chipmunks are pretty few and far between. First of all, there are no toxic baits labeled for use on chipmunks. And I apologize, I should have checked Michigan to make sure, but I'm fairly confident that even in Michigan, there are no toxic baits labeled for use on chipmunks. So, toxic baits that you might use to control mice and rats around your property, you cannot use those on chipmunks. And that's a good thing because chipmunks cache their food. They take more food than they need and they put it somewhere, to chew on it later. And we don't want them doing that with a toxin, poison, okay, then something else can encounter it. So that's kind of why there aren't any toxic baits labeled for use on chipmunks. So if you're having a lot of issues with chipmunks and maybe you've tried some repellents, which you can try capsaicin, and it's not working, and your chipmunk populations are increasing, then you're again looking at trapping. You can use rat traps or live catch traps, which is what I've used in the past with good success. And then pre-baiting helps. Okay, so especially with a live trap, if you leave it open for a couple days, put some peanut butter and oatmeal in there, or some sunflower seeds, or something like that, and get that chipmunk kind of like, maybe not in there, but at the entrance to the trap. So you're kind of like getting them closer and more familiar with the trap, and then you can kind of put that bait in further, just kind of luring them in. That's always a good idea, something good to do. Now, as we've been talking about all these wildlife species that, sorry, I was reading, Patty says she uses cherry tomatoes on a snap trap. Yep, that's another great idea. So as we're talking about all of these wildlife species that we are coexisting with, some of them are predators, and sometimes that can work in our favor. And so what you're looking at are a few pictures that I snapped a couple years ago of tracks outside on my front yard. And I don't know if anybody has any guesses as to what those are. If you do, put them in the chat. But these tracks were about 2 inches in length and close to 1.5 to 2 inches in width. They were canine. I know it's kind of hard to tell probably because there you go. Now they're coming in. So some fox, definitely not cats. They were bigger than cat, bigger than fox. There it is. Verna got it. Coyote. Yeah. So coyote, and I'm not going to get off on a coyote tangent. I could, but I'm not going to. But coyote hunt alone for the most part, and that's because they hunt small prey. And there is an abundance of that in our neighborhoods and in our communities and in our cities, whether it's voles, moles, chipmunks, rabbits, sometimes even groundhogs. they are taking advantage of that. And so I thanked this coyote because that fall I had been having some pretty, well, it was beyond my tolerance level, we can say, some vole damage. And I was like, I gotta get out. I gotta trap them. And I didn't get around to it. And then I saw these, and the next spring and summer, my voles were essentially gone or below my tolerance level, or yeah, below it. I could handle the damage I was still seeing out there. So, you know, just something positive to keep in mind. And many times these coyotes are in our neighborhoods, they're in our communities, and we don't even realize it. Okay, I said earlier that I would kind of compare moles to voles, and so that's what we're going to kind of get into right now. So situation 4 is turf troubles. And so I have 4 pictures here, and there are actually, well, in these pictures specifically, 2 critters causing the damage. So in the both upper pictures and the bottom right is 1 species. And then the bottom left is another. So I see people guessing, yes. Yep, Lori and Kim. Yep, so we're looking at moles. So the top pictures and the bottom right are mole damage, and then the other one is skunk. So that's what we're going to kind of talk a little bit about next. So moles and skunk, and then know also that raccoons will also dig in a yard. And unfortunately, sometimes when they do it, they're a lot more destructive than skunks are. So digging in the yard. Now with moles, as you see here from this picture that I popped up, the top 2 pictures are when the moles are right below the soil surface, kind of where those grass roots are. And they're digging tunnels, they're searching for worms and other soil invertebrates, which is what they really like to eat. And when they do that, they dislodge the grass roots from the soil. And that's why sometimes, especially in this picture, you can see that the grass dies on top. But when you see something like this in this bottom right picture, these mounds of soil, that tells you that the moles are deeper down underground. And they can't just displace that soil above them and create that little raised surface. They actually have to dig a hole to the surface and push that dirt out. So when you see these mounds, unfortunately, you're a little bit more limited on what you can do, because as we're going to talk about trapping, that is effective only when they are right below that soil surface. So just to compare and contrast moles and voles quickly, they're 2 very different animals, even though a lot of times we get them confused as far as the damages they cause. Moles are insectivores. They are looking for worms, beetles, grubs, and other soil-dwelling insects. And I apologize, I have an Ohio slide here, but for the most part, it applies to Michigan as well. And then our voles are a rodent. Okay, so like we talked about with deer and rabbit, they're looking for plant material. And it's easy to get the 2 confused. So this is a picture that I won't say exactly who it was, but it was a company that was advertising their vole control bait systems. And they listed this picture right here, which we know, right, that this is mole damage and not vole damage. So voles don't make mounds of dirt. Voles will sometimes, though, use a mole tunnel to get to plants. Okay, so if you're having plant damage, odds are it's voles or some other critter and not moles, okay? Because they rarely cause damage to plants. Now let's talk a little bit about mole management. And again, I could do a whole talk on this, so if you have questions, just let me know in the chat box or the Q&A box. But one of the methods that is very effective in small backyard properties is trapping, okay? The reason why trapping sometimes does not work is often user error. So familiarize yourself on different types of traps and how to use them. And the other thing that you want to do is dig down to find the tunnel. Now, with some of the traps on the market, you have to do that anyways. That's just how you correctly set the trap. But sometimes we may stick them in the ground over a tunnel and think that we're good to go. But if you, in this example, like you can see in this picture, if one of these trap stakes were to pierce that hole, the mole would just go right around it like it was a tree root or a rock. So you really have to work to make sure the trap is correctly straddling that underground tunnel, which is why digging down can really help you identify where exactly it is. You also want to trap over tunnels that are straight and not really curvy and twisty turny, because the straight ones, think of them as highways. Those are the ones the moles are using repeatedly. And the twisty turvy ones are the side streets. They'll branch off from the highway to search for food, and then they'll come back to the highway and go to a different place. So those are the ones you want to trap over. Another option are toxic baits or poison baits. There are several different types on the market, and I have them listed there. So there's a pellet bait, which the active ingredient is effective, but it comes in a grain or pellet form, which the mole is not interested in eating because it's looking for an invertebrate, right? So the ones that seem to be more effective are those that are grub or worm shaped, and maybe you've heard of them. Unfortunately, I don't have any research to share on you as far as their effectiveness, but I've talked to quite a few wildlife control companies, and they seem to think they're fairly effective. I just caution against any use of toxic baits in a backyard situation, really in any situation, but especially in a backyard situation where there are pets, could be small children. These look like gummies. Now, if you're applying them properly, they are applied underground in an active tunnel, much the same way you would identify an active tunnel for trapping. So they should not be easily accessible to non-target species, but mistakes happen, errors happen. So I don't tend to recommend this one if you have pets, especially a dog that likes to dig. So moving away from moles, let's talk a little bit about other digging damage in the turf, raccoons and skunks. So a couple pictures here of what that looks like. Raccoons can sometimes roll back the sod. So if you see something like that, think raccoon instead of skunks. And here's a little bit more, a picture of more extensive damage that raccoons can cause. So for raccoons and skunks, we talk a lot about habitat modification. So being aware of anything that's going to attract them there in the first place. Denning sites, open places under buildings, brush piles, those are popular places that raccoons and skunks like to den up. Treating lawn for grubs, okay? This may be effective, keeping in mind that there are still other insects in the soil for them to go after. But if your skunk or raccoon damage is coinciding with heavy grub times, then yes, treating your lawn for grubs can be an effective management option. Just be sure to use the treatment for grubs that takes effect immediately. Some of them don't take effect until the next season. And if you need more information on that, you can go to this site that I just popped up. And again, I will share these slides. So I'm going to move here fast because I realize we're at 8 o'clock and I don't want to keep you too past far our time. So that website is part of our Beagle Yard and Garden Online. Now this is an Ohio resource, I'm aware, but I have to share it. It's such a great resource for those of you that are interested in horticulture, interested in gardening, and want to learn about the insects that are emerging, that are causing issues, disease issues, plants, invasive plants. There's just so much good information on these websites or on this website. And you can peruse the articles at will, or you can sign up to have them delivered to your inbox. So I wanted to share that with you quickly. We're going to finish off with our last situation, which is feeding the neighborhood. So maybe you're putting out feeders for the birds, and at nighttime, you may not be aware of other critters visiting. And then during the daytime, of course, battles with squirrels. And I love that picture on the right, that red squirrel that just went straight to the inside of the feeder. And that goldfinch down there that's saying, really, come on. And I just have to show you this really quickly because this is fantastic. Raccoons are well known for their ability to figure out ways to get to food. And so this one is climbing right over the baffle that was put in place to deter squirrels and other critters. And the homeowner here, I don't have the audio playing, but they're thinking that it's going to pull the feeder down. But look at the hind feet. He's turning the feeder. He's actually unscrewing it. And jackpot. So to help you with your wildlife and bird feeder troubles, this is a great publication. Okay, and you can Google the title, you can Google that EC1783 number and find it. You can also go to my blog, which is right there, and I have it listed with a number of other wildlife conflict resources. And there again is my blog as well. And I do have some plant lists for wildlife and other articles if you're interested in that. The other thing we talk about for raccoons, skunks, possums, and others is food. Okay, just keeping in mind of any food resources that are easily accessible. Garbage is an easy one. We already talked about attractive shelter, but rodent control. And this may be something that we don't often think about, but you know, if you have mice, or like we talked about voles, those can sometimes be attractive to skunks in particular. So we think of skunks as being more omnivore in nature, but they are carnivores, and they will take residence in a backyard or nearby if there is a healthy rodent population. And of course, pet food. Okay, they will readily visit a backyard in terms of pet food or other sweet treats like a hummingbird feeder. And so, you know, sometimes the solution is simply to bring in the feeder at night. Don't feed your pets outside and things like that. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but again, know when you get your slides, you will have this. This is the best solution to get rid of skunk smell. You can use it on your pets, keeping it away from the eyes and sensitive places. And you can also use it on hard surfaces. And I see your questions on groundhogs, folks. We can definitely address that. So here is the Michigan DNR site that I've referred to a couple different times. If you search living with wildlife, you can get your nuisance species info. Just click on that green box. You can get information on rehabbers as well, which we'll talk about here in a second. But if you click on this green box, learn how to handle conflicts with wildlife, you will be taken to this page, and there are the gray drop-down boxes that I mentioned earlier where you can get species-specific information. But this right here is your nuisance animal control directory. So if you need help from a professional for any wildlife species, this is the list that you can go to, whether it's trapping or trying to figure out what exactly is going on in your yard. Basically anything we've talked about, those folks can help you. And as we've been talking about trapping, I wanted to make an important point that sometimes it's not the best option. And a great example would be, you know, if you've had a raccoon in your attic or in a building over the summer. Okay, so assume that raccoons living in your attic February through August may be a mother with young. And what's going to happen if you trap that adult? Or sometimes, unfortunately, sometimes you hire a professional and they only trap the adult and there are young inside. Okay, so obviously those young are not going to make it, or you're going to have a box full of young raccoons that you're then taking to a rehab center. And so this is a really real problem. Every year, wildlife centers get hundreds of requests to take orphaned raccoons because, you know, you see this, nobody wants a raccoon roommate, right? And you want that raccoon out and you just don't realize that it could be a female with young. And so this is an example of, you know, an attic, but keep in mind, this could be the situation with a raccoon under your porch or your deck or a shed in your yard during the summer. So you always want to keep that in mind. You know, during the summer, that's when the babies are being born. So you want to do your sealing up any openings underneath foundations early in the year. Otherwise, you're going to want to wait until the end of the year just to make sure nothing's down in there. Okay, so I have just a few examples of some things besides trapping that you can do if you have a raccoon living in your attic. So, you know, mama raccoons are going to choose sites that are dark, quiet, and safe. Bottom line. So anything you can do to make it not quiet, not dark, and not safe, she's going to move on. Okay, so that could be, you know, taking a radio and turning it on up in the attic to make it very loud. Also placing lights that flash or that are always lighting up the area. Those are two things that can be really effective and cause that female to move on. Okay, And sometimes just being patient works. Female raccoons often use different den sites, so she may move on anyways. So monitor the situation. And again, get help from a professional if you need it. Just be aware it could be a mom. So I mentioned this earlier, and this is very timely as we move into spring, and as we're still spending a lot of time at home, you may see a wildlife species that you, or a wildlife baby that you think is orphaned, but odds are it's not. Many of our wildlife moms and dads will leave their young alone during the day just to keep predators away. So they're not attracting a lot of attention to wherever that young is kind of sheltered up. And so these are 2 pictures I took in my own backyard last summer of a grackle on the left and mourning dove on the right. And multiple days I encountered the young after they had fledged the nest on their own during the day, kind of hunkered down under a shrub. And so, you might see that and think, oh no, but just keep in mind, this is totally normal. And many of our wildlife parents do this. That said, there are times when an animal may truly be orphaned or sick or injured. And I wanted to give you a resource to go to if you encounter that. Okay, so wrapping things up here, knowing the species or knowing that species coexist with us and knowing their habitat needs can get you a long way walking into that situation and just having that knowledge. Always think about habitat modification and what's attracting the animal there in the first place, and if you can modify it or change it. Know your available management options and where and when to seek help. And realize that the wildlife are here to stay, and you need to find your own level of tolerance and coexistence. And I don't have time to play this, but if you want a funny story, look up Chunk the Groundhog on YouTube. And this is basically a guy who had a small vegetable garden in his backyard and encountered a very persistent groundhog. And he put up a trail camera to figure out what was going on. And he found out that this particular groundhog loved to eat in front of the camera. So if we have time, I can play it for you. But it's really funny. And so through, watching this animal, he learned to appreciate it. And he actually ended up planting another garden for the groundhog, who he named Chunk. And that was how he coexisted with the groundhog. Now this groundhog has his own YouTube channel, and they're constantly posting videos. So of course it became a big thing. Now, I'm not suggesting that you all go this way and plant a separate garden for groundhogs. But what this story does share is the overriding message that coexistence is necessary, and that at some point you're going to have conflict with wildlife. And thinking that you can eliminate it completely is unrealistic, okay? Especially if you're working to bring in pollinators and birds, okay? So we all need to work to find our own comfort level with the wildlife and all the wildlife. But the bright side is this, okay? Living with wildlife connects us to nature, even the species that we sometimes have trouble with. And fostering that connection with nature and with wildlife, not just in us, but in future generations, is so critical right now. So my very small backyard patch of milkweed is where my daughter, which you see there on the left, first experienced holding a monarch butterfly, and she's never forgotten it. And now every year she asks me, when are we going to see the butterflies? When are the butterflies coming back? And seeing that, now 80% of the human population lives in urban areas. It's our backyards, it's our parks, it's our communities that really give people those firsthand experiences with wildlife. So it's a really powerful role that our backyards and community spaces can play. And you all, as master gardeners, you work in those spaces, and sometimes you are the voices in your community when it comes to those outdoor spaces. So you have that same power. So I wanted to leave you on that note. And I hope you all have fun wildscaping your communities and your backyards, and hopefully you don't let the wildlife cause you too much grief. So there's my contact information. Do feel free to reach out to me Again, my blog site, it's new, so there's not a lot of information there, but I'm trying to keep it populated. So check that out if you'd like some more information. So I will stop sharing for now, and I'm sorry that I went over, Sue, but hopefully we still have some time for questions.
We do, and we didn't set a limit on time, so.
Oh, good.
We wanted everybody to be able to get all their questions answered.
Wonderful.
So, remember, we had the question about dealing with ducks in the garden.
Yes, yes. So when we talk about our birds, we have to first realize that many of them are protected. So they're protected under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, which is a multi-country act. And so that says that we cannot harm the birds, we cannot harm their nests or the young. And so what we're oftentimes left with is harassment, scaring the birds away or putting up physical barriers to keep them away from areas. So, not knowing the specific details of the situation, think about if a short fence may work to keep them out of an area that they're accessing, if it's a garden or your landscape area. Sometimes that can be very effective. You can also try different types of harassment. Again, smart sprinklers may be effective if you're protecting a small area. And you can also try, lights and loud noises and things like that. So hopefully that gives you some ideas. If you search out some fact sheets on Canada geese, which I know OSU Extension has one, and I'm sure Michigan does as well. But many of the same harassment techniques that you can use against geese also apply to ducks. And you'll probably have better luck with ducks because they're not nearly as persistent as geese.
As the geese, right.
Yes.
I would like to remind people, I've mentioned this before, but if you're not familiar with MSU Extension Gardening in Michigan website, I put the link for the tip sheets in earlier this evening. It's such a fabulous resource. I love the Smart Gardening program myself and have been very involved. So I encourage you to check that out. I'd like to remind people that our next webinar is Saturday, March 20th at 11 a.m. Native Spring Ephemerals. And if you just want to get excited about what we're going to see pretty soon, our presenter has so many gorgeous photos. Just seeing those will really, I think, make you feel better. And then if you enjoyed Marnie, which I know we have tonight, and I've heard her before, and that's why I was so thrilled she's providing these for us. She will be back with us Thursday, March 25th at 7 p.m. talking about impact of invasive species on wildlife, which I'm really looking forward to hearing. Let me check the question box one more time. Oh, we have some more questions.
Yeah.
Let's see. Woodchucks under the foundation and back room or shed slab, how do we evict them?
Yeah, so I didn't touch on groundhogs, apologies, because I know they're definitely an issue. So they're a bit tougher to evict using non-lethal methods, though. I mean, so trapping is definitely an option. And it's a good option. And keep in mind, if they're underneath a foundation, you can trap them, set that trap aside, and then seal up that foundation. Of course, making sure that you're trapping earlier or later so you don't, seal up young underneath the foundation. So that's an option. But if you don't want to trap, it's a tough road, I'll be honest with you, because basically what you're going to be doing is refilling those burrows. You can use wire mesh to kind of block off around the foundation. That might help. But that's really what you're going to be looking at to try to discourage them that way. If they're feeding nearby, which they probably are, you can try repellents. Capsaicin is a good one. And then, just get creative. Harassment, whether it's, again, that smart sprinkler, noise harassment, light harassment, anything like that, to just make that denning area generally uncomfortable. So those are some suggestions that you might try.
Broccoli worked really well for me in a live trap.
Okay, yeah.
We tried peanut butter, grapes, cat food, caught a cat.
Oh no, yeah, you gotta
Yeah.
be careful there.
You know, everything that was suggested, but somewhere I read the head of broccoli. So
Oh,
I
that's good
chopped
to
it up
know.
and put it in and
Yeah.
caught one. And the next year, the next groundhog was much smarter about the broccoli and didn't go
Yeah,
in.
they learn. Yeah, they learn, unfortunately.
Well, Marty, I think that's all the questions we had. I want to
I-
thank you and everyone for joining us tonight. We look forward to seeing you on Saturday. I know it's supposed to be really nice weather here in Michigan, but I hope you can take about an hour and a half out of your Saturday to be with us. Thank you very much for joining us. And Vicki, you may turn the webinar off. Good night, everyone.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Night, Marty.